personal trainer asked a black janitor to do a workout for fun. He accepted the challenge and shut everyone down. "Hey, you there cleaning. How about showing everyone how not to work out?" shouted Blake Morrison from the center of the gym, adjusting his tight tank top that highlighted muscle sculpted by years of expensive supplements and well-dosed steroids. It was Thursday night at Elite Fitness Gym, and the city's most famous personal trainer had decided he needed some entertainment. His 5 wealthy clients, all wives of local businessmen, laughed nervously as they watched the scene unfold. Antonio Silva, 43, stopped wiping the mirror and looked up slowly. He had been working at that gym for 3 months, always arriving after hours to clean in peace. But tonight, Blake's VIP workout had gone on longer than usual. "Sorry, I don't want to get in the way of your work," Antonio replied calmly, returning to cleaning a stubborn stain on the mirror. "Just finishing up here so you can get going." Blake let out a theatrical laugh that echoed through the empty gym. "Guys, look at this." The guy's afraid to even step on the mat. The 5 women laughed awkwardly, some clearly uncomfortable with the situation. What Blake didn't know was that Antonio had spent the last 15 years trying to forget who he really was. 15 years since he left the ring after an accident that changed his life forever. 15 years keeping a secret that not even his teenage daughter knew about. "Come on, man," Blake continued, approaching him with that arrogant smile he used to intimidate beginners. "Just a little demonstration. I bet you don't even know how to do a push-up properly. How about you show my students the difference between someone who really trains and someone who just cleans up after the real athletes?" Antonio felt that familiar sensation in his chest, like a dormant muscle being awakened after years of inactivity. His eyes met Blake's briefly, and for a split second, something passed between them that made the instructor take an involuntary step back. "Just an educational demonstration," Blake insisted, now trying to hide the sudden uncertainty in his voice. "Nothing too serious, just to show the beginners why it's important to respect those who really understand fitness." Antonio put the bucket on the floor and stood up slowly. His movements had a fluidity that was strange for someone who had supposedly never set foot in a gym before. Around the room, the 5 women stopped talking, realizing that something was happening. "All right," Antonio said finally, his voice calm like the surface of a lake before a storm. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to all of them for turning this place into a circus." Blake laughed, but this time the sound came out a little forced. "Apologize? Man, you're going to be apologizing to the floor when you get to know him up close." What none of those people knew was that Antonio Silva had once been Antonio Demolador Silva, 3-time world kickboxing and MMA champion. He had retired at the height of his career after an accident that cost the life of his best friend and training partner. Since then, he had sworn never to fight again. But some promises are made to be broken when dignity is at stake. There, in front of all the contemptuous stares, Antonio stood firm, like someone guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. If this story of prejudice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of humiliation would become the catalyst for a lesson that no one would ever forget. Blake adjusted his tank top once more, clearly relishing every second of attention. "Everyone, gather around. You're about to see a practical demonstration of why there is a hierarchy in the fitness world." The 5 women formed a semicircle around the mat, some eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable. Jennifer Walsh, wife of the owner of the largest dealership in town, whispered something to her friend next to her, who just shook her head in disapproval. "Look everyone," Blake continued, gesturing dramatically. "Here we have a perfect example of someone who never understood that there are appropriate places for certain people. Elite gyms are not for, well, you know." Antonio felt that familiar twinge in his chest, the same one he had felt 15 years ago when he heard similar comments about fighters who didn't look like champions. The difference was that now, at 43, he had learned to turn anger into fuel for something much more powerful than punches. "Mr. Blake," Jennifer interrupted timidly, "perhaps we can continue our normal training. It's getting late." "And Jennifer Walsh, are you questioning my teaching methodology?" Blake cut her off sharply. "Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than you will in a month of conventional training." Antonio noticed how Blake used the girl's full name, a clear demonstration of authority. He also recognized the look of fear in her eyes. It was the same look he saw in the mirror 2 decades ago when he woke up in a panic, remembering the accident that took the life of Ricardo Martello Torres, his best friend and training partner. Ricardo had died because of him. It was that simple. A series of blows that Antonio had delivered with excessive force during sparring. Ricardo fell, hit his head on the floor in a strange way, and never woke up. The investigation concluded that it was an accident, but Antonio knew the truth. He had lost control because of the pressure and the racist comments from the audience that night. "So, Janitor," Blake sneered. "How about showing my students how to put up some basic protection? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" Laughter echoed through the gym, but Antonio stood motionless. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment, he was back in that ring in Las Vegas, hearing the same kinds of comments that preceded the tragedy that changed his life forever. "What's the problem? Are you scared?" Blake insisted, now circling Antonio like a predator. "Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost with a mop on your head all day?" That was when Blake made his first fatal mistake. He pushed Antonio lightly on the shoulder, a seemingly harmless touch, but one that carried all the arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Antonio absorbed the push without moving an inch. His feet remained planted on the ground like oak roots, and Blake felt as if he had tried to push a concrete wall. The instructor's arrogant smile faltered for a split second. "Interesting," Antonio muttered, more to himself than to Blake. "It's been a long time since someone tried to provoke me like that." There was something in Antonio's voice that changed the atmosphere. It wasn't threat or anger. It was the frightening calm of someone who had walked through much darker valleys and emerged transformed. Blake, unable to interpret the danger signals, doubled down. "Did you hear that, guys? He thinks it's interesting. How about we show him the difference between thinking and knowing?" What Blake didn't realize was that every humiliating word and gesture was awakening something in Antonio that had been dormant for 2 decades. Not anger or a thirst for revenge, but something far more dangerous, the crystal-clear memory of who he really was when he stopped hiding. Jennifer Walsh watched the scene with growing discomfort. There was something about the way the janitor was breathing, the way his muscles were tensing almost imperceptibly, that reminded her of the documentaries about large predators she watched on the Discovery Channel. The calm before the attack. "Last chance, man," Blake announced, now clearly irritated by Antonio's lack of response. "Either you accept the demonstration like a man, or I'll call security to escort you out. And guess what? You lose your job too." Antonio opened his eyes slowly. When his gaze met Blake's, the instructor felt a chill run down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he thought was a harmless lizard. "All right," Antonio said finally, his voice low but laden with an authority that made everyone present fall silent instantly. "But when we're done, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a circus of humiliation." Blake laughed, but this time the sound came out nervous. "Explain? Man, you're going to have a lot to explain when you're on the floor." What neither of them knew was that Antonio had spent the last 15 years not only running from his past, but perfecting an emotional control that had transformed his former destructive rage into something much more refined and devastatingly effective. Each new humiliation only fueled a silent strength within him, a cold determination that his former opponents knew well, but that Blake was about to discover in the worst possible way. What those privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing their own sentence of defeat, and that the real storm was just beginning to form in the calculated silence of those who had already survived battles they couldn't even imagine. Blake adjusted his posture, clearly pleased with the respectful silence that had fallen over the gym. His 5 students formed a perfect circle around the mat. Some were eager for the demonstration, others visibly uncomfortable with the situation unfolding before them. "Everyone, you are about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training," Blake announced theatrically, extending his arms like a circus ringmaster. "The difference between those who dedicate their lives to true fitness and those who just, well, clean the floor where real athletes walk." Antonio remained motionless in the center of the mat. But something had changed in his breathing. His eyes closed briefly, and for a moment, he was no longer in that gym in Denver. He was back at the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical comments from the crowd before his world title fight against Victor the Demolition Man Petrov. "Look at that little nigger," someone had shouted that distant night. "I bet he won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." Antonio had won by technical knockout in the 2nd round, but the victory had cost him dearly. The pressure of the racist comments caused him to lose control in the next training session, resulting in the accidental death of Ricardo Torres. So Janitor, Blake sneered, now circling Antonio like a predator. How about showing my students how not to do basic protection? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop? That's when Jennifer Chin couldn't stay silent any longer. The 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu and master student in sports psychology had spent the last 2 years documenting cases of discrimination in sports for her thesis. What she was witnessing was valuable academic material, but it was also deeply disturbing. Sensei Blake, she interrupted firmly. Can I ask you a question? Why exactly do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who is just doing their job? The silence that followed was deafening. Blake slowly turned to Jennifer, his eyes narrowing in a mixture of surprise and irritation. Excuse me, Jennifer, but who is teaching the class here? You are, she replied calmly, but that shouldn't include racial humiliation disguised as a technical demonstration. Several students exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever confronted Blake like that before. The instructor felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Racial. Blake laughed harshly. This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with respect for fitness and knowing your place. Antonio's eyes widened slowly. There was something in the way Jennifer had spoken, in the courage of a young woman standing up to established authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Keisha. She had had that same determination, that same refusal to accept injustice silently. Keisha had died at 17, the victim of a stray bullet during a police confrontation in her neighborhood. Antonio was competing in Japan when he received the news. Another person he loved lost while he sought glory in distant rings. Another reason to abandon everything and disappear into the simplicity of an anonymous life. Jennifer, Blake said in a dangerously low voice, if you can't respect my teaching methods, maybe you should find another gym. There are more suitable places for people with your mentality. The threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. My tuition is paid, Sensei. And I believe that everyone here deserves a learning environment based on mutual respect, not humiliation. That's when Antonio did something no one expected. He began to smile. It wasn't a nervous or submissive smile. It was the slow, calculated smile of someone who had just found a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the weight of guilt for 2 deaths that had indirectly resulted from his involvement in the world of fighting. Now, seeing a brave young woman defending principles of justice that he had abandoned decades ago, Antonio Washington began to remember who he really was. Blake, Antonio said finally, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to him. The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others. Blake spun on her heel, her face red with indignation. How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is. Antonio took a step forward, and something fundamental changed in his posture. His shoulders straightened, his center of gravity lowered imperceptibly, and his feet positioned themselves in a stance that any experienced fighter would instantly recognize as perfect. Actually, Antonio said calmly, I know exactly what a dojo is. And I know that this place stopped being one a long time ago. Blake felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine. There was something about the way Antonio moved now, the way he occupied the space, that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. But his wounded pride would not allow him to back down. Enough talk, Blake growled, assuming his favorite fighting stance. I'll teach you respect the hard way. Jennifer watched the scene with growing apprehension, but also with professional fascination. She had documented hundreds of hours of sparring and competition for her research, and something about the way the janitor moved reminded her of the great masters she had studied in historical videos. The economy of movement, the controlled breathing, the calm presence that radiated contained power. Antonio closed his eyes briefly and allowed 22 years of muscle memory to resurface. Every technique perfected, every victory won, every lesson learned in the world's most brutal rings. When he opened them again, Blake was looking directly into the eyes of Antonio de Molador Silva, 3-time world mixed martial arts champion. Last chance to apologize, Antonio offered kindly. To her students, and to turn this place back into a learning environment. Blake laughed, but the sound came out nervous and forced. Apologize? Man, you'll be begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor. What Blake couldn't see was that Antonio had already identified all of his technical weaknesses. The high guard that left his body exposed. The tendency to retreat with his right leg first. The way he telegraphed his punches with micro-movements of his shoulder. 22 years away from the ring hadn't erased decades of refined technical analysis. Jennifer noticed that the other students were instinctively moving away, like wild animals sensing an impending storm. Something in the energy of the room had completely changed, as if the air had become electrified before a lightning strike. It was when everyone laughed at Blake's latest insults that something unexpected began to take shape in Antonio's expression. Not anger or a desire for revenge, but the calm determination of someone who had found a cause worthy of breaking a 20-year vow of silence. Some of those present began to realize that something extraordinary was about to happen, even without fully understanding what their eyes were witnessing. Blake assumed his favorite fighting stance, the same one he had used to intimidate hundreds of beginners over the years. Feet shoulder-width apart, fists clenched at chest level, weight slightly forward. The classic stance of someone who had learned martial arts in controlled environments against predictable opponents. Antonio stood motionless for a few seconds, simply watching. His eyes scanned Blake from head to toe, automatically cataloging every technical detail. The high guard that left his ribs exposed. The unstable base that compromised his balance. The excessive tension in his shoulders that telegraphed every move before it even began. Still waiting. Blake taunted, bouncing slightly on his feet. Or are you just going to stand there like a lamppost? That's when Antonio did something no one expected. He began to move. It wasn't a dramatic change, just a subtle repositioning of his feet, a slight lowering of his center of gravity, his shoulders relaxing into a perfectly horizontal line. But for those who knew what to look for, the transformation was instant and frightening. Jennifer Chin felt a chill run down her spine. During 2 years studying sports biomechanics, she had analyzed hundreds of hours of footage of great fighters. What she had just witnessed was the transition from an ordinary man to a born predator. A change as subtle as it was devastating. Interesting, Blake muttered, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about the way Antonio occupied the space now that awakened all of his self-preservation instincts. Antonio took a step forward, and Blake instinctively stepped back. The movement was so involuntary, so primitive, that several female students noticed. A black belt backing away from a janitor. The power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Problem? Antonio asked softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced everyone. Blake felt the blood rush to his cheeks. His reputation was being questioned in front of his own students. He couldn't back down now, even though every fiber of his being was screaming to stop and apologize. No problem, Blake replied, forcing a smile. Just admiring your posture. Did someone teach you that on YouTube? The joke fell flat. No one laughed. The tension in the room had become almost palpable. Actually, Antonio said calmly, I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it. Blake frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place the reference. Las Vegas? What kind of weekend boot camp did you do there? Jennifer Chin discreetly took her cell phone out of her pocket and quickly typed, Las Vegas National Gym Martial Arts. What she found made her blood run cold. It wasn't just any prep course. It was where the greatest MMA world champions of the last 3 decades had trained. Blake, Antonio continued, his voice still calm, last chance. Apologized to Jennifer for questioning her right to speak. Apologized to her students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of person that martial arts should teach you not to be. The offer of clemency hung in the air like smoke. Blake could have chosen humility. He could have acknowledged that he had crossed a line. He could have preserved what little dignity he had left. Instead, he attacked. Blake's first punch was technically perfect. A quick, precise jab, executed exactly as he had learned in the manuals. It was the kind of punch that worked against 99% of the people he had fought over the years. Antonio was not in the 99%. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that half the people in attendance couldn't even process what had happened. Antonio simply wasn't where Blake's fist had been aimed. His body had slid sideways like water flowing around a rock. And suddenly, Blake was off balance, his arm extended in the air. Nice try, Antonio said softly. Already repositioned and perfectly balanced. Clean technique, adequate speed, but you telegraphed the move with your right shoulder. Blake spun around violently, trying to locate his opponent. How had someone moved so fast? Beginner's luck, he muttered, more to himself than to Antonio. The second attack came in quick succession. Jab, straight, hook. 3 punches linked together with the precision of someone who had practiced the combination thousands of times. It was his favorite sequence, the one he used to finish sparring sessions and impress beginners. Again, Antonio simply wasn't there. This time, Janitor managed to follow the movement. Antonio had lowered himself slightly, allowing the jab to pass over his head by inches. The straight punch found only air as he leaned back in an impossible curve. And when Blake threw the hook with all his strength, Antonio took a small step back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his chin. Interesting combination, Antonio observed, still breathing evenly. It works well against people who stand still, but you're leaving your entire left side completely exposed. After the hook, Blake was starting to sweat. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of punches in his life, and now he couldn't land a single one on a person who had supposedly never fought before. "Stop dancing and fight," Blake shouted, launching an even more aggressive sequence. That's when Antonio decided the demonstration had gone on long enough. Blake's third attack, a desperate combination of punches and kicks, found only air once again. But this time, something different happened. When Blake recovered after missing all his blows, Antonio was inexplicably closer. "How?" Blake whispered, realizing he had completely lost control of the distance. "Blake," Antonio said softly, now an arm's length away. "Want to know the difference between someone who learned to fight in gyms and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Blake could answer, Antonio did something that defied everything those present thought they knew about physics. Without appearing to use any force, without any sudden or aggressive movements, he simply touched Blake on the chest with the palm of his right hand. Blake flew. He wasn't pushed or knocked down. He was literally propelled backward as if hit by an invisible wave. His feet left the ground. He traveled almost 2 meters through the air and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The silence that followed was absolute. Blake lay on the floor for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. There was no pain, just the irresistible force of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. That's impossible," Blake muttered, trying to get up. "Actually," Antonio said calmly, extending his hand to help Blake up, "it's quite simple once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles I've learned over a 22-year professional career." Blake ignored the outstretched hand and stood up on his own, his legs still shaking. 22 years of professional experience in what?" Janitor replied, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand who he is, do you?" Everyone turned to her, who was still holding her cell phone with the results of her search. On the screen, dozens of articles, photos, and videos confirmed what her instincts had already realized. "Antonio Silva," she read aloud, "also known as Demoledor, 3-time world mixed martial arts champion, considered one of the best technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after a 22-year career, following an accident that resulted in the death of his training partner." The impact of the words hit the room like a bomb. Blake felt his face go pale as reality set in. He had challenged a living martial arts legend. He had publicly humiliated someone who could have knocked him out with a casual move. Three-time world champion? Blake stammered, all his arrogance evaporating instantly. Antonio nodded silently. "I retired at 31. Since then, I've worked any job I could find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple jobs, simple life. No spotlight, no cameras, no need to prove anything to anyone." The transformation in Blake was instantaneous and painful to watch. The arrogant man was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of his ignorance. I didn't know," Blake whispered. "If I had known." "If you had known, would you have treated me with respect?" Antonio interrupted gently. "But would you still have humiliated some other janitor? Another worker who didn't have the credentials to defend himself?" The question cut deeper than any physical blow. Blake realized that Antonio had put his finger on the root of his real problem. It wasn't ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental arrogance that made him believe he could humiliate people based on their professions. Janitor stepped forward, her voice firm. Sensei Blake, for 2 years I have trained at this academy out of respect for your experience. But what I witnessed today was not teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction. Other students began to murmur in agreement. The revelation about Antonio had completely changed everyone's perspective on what they had witnessed. Antonio, Blake said finally, his voice laden with a humility no one there had ever heard before. I sincerely apologize to you, to Jennifer, to everyone here. I have no excuse for my behavior. Antonio nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace with which he had mastered the physical confrontation. Appreciated, Blake, but apologies are only the first step. The question is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Blake looked around the room, seeing his students with new eyes. Some seemed disappointed in his behavior, others clearly re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about respect and hierarchy. I'll change, Blake promised. It'll take time, but I'll change. That's when Jennifer asked a question that surprised everyone. Mr. Silva, would you consider teaching again? Because I think we could all learn a lot more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility. Antonio smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him that night. Maybe, but not to teach fighting techniques. To teach something much more important, that respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. As Blake fully absorbed the most humiliating lesson of his life, one question hung in the air: would one night of humility be enough to transform decades of arrogance? Or would an even deeper change be necessary for true justice to be served? 3 months later, the gym had been completely transformed. Antonio Silva was no longer just the janitor. Jennifer had convinced the owner to hire him as an instructor specializing in advanced techniques and martial arts philosophy. Blake Mitchell lost half of his students in the first week after the incident. The video Jennifer had discreetly recorded spread across social media, showing a black belt being humiliated by a mere janitor. His reputation in the martial arts community was ruined. Sensei Antonio, Jennifer said after a class on respect and humility. Thank you for teaching me that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized. Antonio smiled, organizing the equipment. The best lesson I can teach is simple: never judge someone by their profession or appearance. Everyone carries stories that can surprise us. Blake continued teaching at a smaller gym, but now with a humility forced by public shame. He had learned the hard way that arrogance comes at a price. Sometimes justice comes quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. Antonio proved that true revenge is not destroying your opponent, but showing that greatness comes from character, not titles. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.